Every conflict that rises in your life is an invitation. It is not merely a disturbance or an inconvenience. It is a mirror that shows you the parts of yourself you have not yet understood. When you recognize this, the entire weight of conflict changes. It no longer remains something you want to escape. It becomes something you can learn from. Conflict is rarely about the surface level issue that appears in front of you. Most of the time, what you see is only the final expression of something much deeper, something that has been growing quietly inside both individuals for a long time. To understand the root of conflict, you must first recognize that every disagreement carries a history. It carries the weight of past experiences, unspoken fears, unmet expectations, and the silent assumptions that shape how two people perceive each moment. When you look only at the words spoken, you miss the truth. The real cause often lies beneath those words, embedded in emotions and interpretations formed long before the conversation began. Every person sees the world not as it is, but as they are. When two perspectives shaped by different experiences meet, misalignment is natural. One person may view a certain tone as disrespect, while another sees it as ordinary. One person may interpret a delay as disinterest, while the other sees it as unavoidable. Conflict arises when these interpretations collide without awareness. You cannot understand the root of conflict if you look only at the event. You must look at the perception surrounding the event. This requires a level of honesty that many avoid because it means recognizing how your own inner world contributes to the tension. To understand conflict, observe how emotions guide your behavior. Anger does not appear out of nowhere. It grows from feeling unheard, unappreciated, or threatened. Frustration builds when expectations are not communicated clearly. Hurt develops when old wounds are touched, even unintentionally. When you become aware of these emotional layers, the conflict changes shape. It is no longer just the other person who is at fault. It becomes a shared dynamic that both people are participating in, whether consciously or not. This awareness is the foundation of transformation, because what you understand cannot control you in the same way that what remains unconscious does. When you examine the root of conflict, you begin to see how much of it comes from attachment to identity. You want to be right, respected, valued, acknowledged. When any of these parts of your identity feel threatened, the mind reacts with force. It builds walls. It prepares arguments. It becomes defensive. The interesting thing is that these reactions rarely come from the present moment. They come from the past. They come from old experiences where you felt powerless or misunderstood. Without realizing it, the mind keeps trying to protect that old version of you. Conflict becomes a continuation of a story you may not even be aware you are still carrying. Understanding the root of conflict requires stepping back from the immediate intensity and observing the pattern behind it. What makes you react the way you do? What belief is driving your emotion? What fear is hiding beneath your anger? What expectation you carried that was never spoken aloud? These questions do not weaken you. They illuminate you. Through them, you begin to realize that conflict is not an enemy, but a messenger. It points to the areas within yourself that are asking for clarity, for healing, and for awareness. When you understand this root, the outer conflict loses much of its power because you begin to see that it was never truly about the argument at all. Awareness before reaction is the ability to pause in the single moment when your emotions begin to rise, and instead of letting them take control, you observe them with clarity. This is not something that happens naturally because the human mind is trained through habit. When someone challenges your belief, questions your intention, or speaks in a tone that triggers an old memory, the instinctive response is immediate. You defend, you argue, you interrupt, or you withdraw. This automatic reaction comes from the patterns you have repeated for many years. To bring awareness into that space means to interrupt a cycle that has been shaping your behavior for a long time. The moment you feel tension building in your chest, or your breath becoming shallow, or your thoughts speeding ahead of your judgment, that is the exact moment when awareness must enter. Most people only notice their emotions after they have already reacted. They realize they spoke too fast, interpreted too harshly, or acted too strongly. But awareness before reaction means noticing the emotional spark before it becomes a fire. It means recognizing the inner shift at its earliest stage. This single skill changes the course of every conflict because you are no longer being led by your emotions. You are leading them. To cultivate this awareness, you start by paying attention to your inner signals. Notice how your body responds when you feel misunderstood. Notice the tightening in your shoulders when someone disagrees with you. Notice the change in your breathing when a sensitive topic appears. These physical sensations show you that something is happening internally long before the mind forms a reaction. When you learn to recognize these signals, you give yourself the advantage of time. Even a few seconds of awareness can redirect an entire conversation. Awareness before reaction also requires honesty. Not honesty with the other person first, but honesty with yourself. You must be willing to admit when your reaction is shaped by fear, insecurity, or ego rather than clarity. You must acknowledge when the emotion is heavier than the moment itself. Many times, the intensity you feel is not coming from the present situation, but from the unresolved experiences of your past. When you see this truth, the emotion loses its force because you begin to understand that you are not reacting to the person in front of you. You are reacting to a memory within you. Another important aspect of awareness is the understanding that silence is not weakness. When you pause before responding, you are not avoiding the conflict. You are preparing yourself to handle it with stability. The pause is where wisdom enters. The pause is where you separate what is real from what is imagined. The pause is where you decide whether your next words will bring clarity or deepen the misunderstanding. Without this pause, you speak from instinct. With it, you speak from awareness. Awareness before reaction is the foundation of emotional mastery. It teaches you that your internal world can remain stable even when the external world becomes chaotic. When you stop reacting automatically, you create a space where understanding can grow. In that space, conflict begins to soften because the energy that usually fuels it is no longer present. Through awareness, you transform not only the way you respond to others, but also the way you understand yourself. Listening without defending is one of the most challenging skills to develop because it requires you to set aside the part of yourself that constantly wants to prove, justify, or protect your position. Most people do not listen to understand. They listen to prepare their next argument. While the other person is speaking, their mind is already building a response, searching for flaws or collecting evidence to protect their own viewpoint. This approach feeds conflict rather than dissolving it. True listening demands stillness. It demands the ability to empty the mind of its need to be right, even for a brief moment. When you listen without defending, you shift your focus from your internal dialogue to the other person's reality. You begin to hear not only the words, but the intention behind those words. You begin to sense the emotion, the discomfort, or the confusion that the other person may not be able to express clearly. Often, behind anger there is fear. Behind frustration there is disappointment. Behind silence there is hurt. When your attention is no longer occupied with defending yourself, you can perceive these deeper layers. This is what transforms the conversation, because human beings soften when they feel understood. Listening in this way does not mean you agree with everything being said. It simply means you are choosing not to react from ego. The ego fears being wrong. It fears losing control. It fears being misunderstood. So it interrupts, defends, corrects, or attacks. When you set aside these impulses, even for a moment, you allow a more grounded version of yourself to engage. This version is not driven by insecurity. It is guided by awareness. From this space, you can hold another person's words without absorbing them as an attack. To listen without defending, you must first quiet the inner commentary. That commentary says things like, "That is not true," or "You do not understand me," or "I need to correct this." When these thoughts arise, notice them, but do not act on them. Let them pass through your awareness like clouds moving across the sky. The moment you stop feeding them, the mind becomes quieter. In that quiet, your ability to understand expands. This is where you begin to hear the meaning beneath the message. Another part of listening without defending is giving the other person the freedom to express themselves fully. Many conflicts escalate because one person interrupts or reacts too quickly. When you allow the other person to finish, you give them the space to release the emotion they are carrying. This alone can reduce tension because most people raise their volume when they feel unheard. When you listen with patience and presence, the volume naturally lowers. What begins as a heated exchange gradually becomes a more human conversation. Listening without defending also teaches you humility. It reveals that your perspective is only one part of the entire picture. The other person's experience is shaped by their own memories, values, and interpretations. When you understand this, you stop expecting them to think or feel exactly as you do. This realization removes a great amount of pressure from the interaction. It allows both sides to relax into a more honest exchange. Finally, listening in this way strengthens connection. When someone feels truly heard, they no longer need to fight for recognition. They no longer need to push their point with force. The defense falls away on both sides, and what remains is clarity. Through this clarity, conflict begins to dissolve, not because anyone has won, but because both have finally understood. Tension within conflict often feels like a force that pulls you away from your center. Your breath shortens, your thoughts accelerate, and your body prepares itself for confrontation long before any clear intention is formed. Yet this very tension that seems to disturb your stability contains the potential to guide you back into an even deeper stillness. The key is to understand that tension is not your enemy. It is a signal, a messenger, an inner echo that reveals where your awareness is needed most. When you learn how to meet this tension, without resisting it. It becomes a bridge leading you back to your own clarity. When you feel tension rising, your mind usually begins to search for explanations. It focuses on the other person's words, their tone, their actions, or the perceived unfairness of the situation. But the real source of turmoil is rarely external. The disturbance comes from the interpretation your mind is creating. Tension increases when your inner world becomes misaligned with the present moment. By turning your attention inward instead of outward, you can begin to observe this misalignment. You notice how your expectations, your fears, or your old emotional patterns are influencing your perception. This observation alone begins to soften the intensity. Inner stillness does not arrive by suppressing your emotions. It arrives by giving those emotions space to exist without being judged. When you allow yourself to feel the discomfort fully, without trying to push it away, the mind becomes less reactive. The feeling rises, reaches its peak, and then naturally begins to dissolve. This is the nature of emotions when awareness is present. They pass through you, instead of staying trapped within you. If you resist them, they grow stronger. If you observe them, they lose their power. One of the most effective ways to transform tension into stillness is to anchor yourself in the rhythm of your breath. The breath is always present, always accessible, and always honest. When conflict arises, breathe deeper and slower than you feel you need to. This simple act brings your attention back to your body and back to the current moment. Your breath becomes a stabilizing force, reminding you that you do not need to rush into reaction. As your breath steadies, your mind follows, and the tension gradually loosens its grip. Turning tension into inner stillness also involves shifting your internal posture. Instead of leaning forward into the argument, lean inward into yourself. Instead of tightening your muscles, allow them to soften. Instead of trying to control the situation, release your attachment to the outcome. This shift is subtle but powerful. It transforms your presence. The other person senses the calm within you, and that calm influences the energy of the entire conversation. Conflict often escalates when both individuals are anchored in tension. When one person anchors themselves in stillness, the dynamic begins to change. As you practice this inner shift repeatedly, you begin to realize that tension is not something to fear. It is a doorway. It shows you where your inner work lies. It reveals the parts of yourself that are still fragile, still reactive, or still shaped by past experiences. Meeting this tension with awareness strengthens you. It teaches you that clarity does not emerge from controlling the external world, but from stabilizing your internal one. Through this understanding, tension becomes a guide rather than a burden, leading you toward a deeper, more resilient stillness each time it appears. Speaking with intention rather than instinct is the practice of choosing your words from a place of clarity, rather than from the automatic impulses shaped by emotion, habit, and past experiences. When conflict arises, instinctive speech is the default. Instinctive speech is fast, unfiltered, and fueled by the desire to protect yourself. It is shaped by fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing control, or fear of appearing weak. When you speak from instinct, the words often become sharper than you intend, heavier than the moment requires, or more defensive than the situation deserves. This is how minor misunderstandings transform into major conflicts. The shift toward intentional speech begins the moment you decide that your words should serve understanding rather than victory. Speaking with intention requires awareness of the inner state from which your words are born. When you feel anger rising, your instinct wants to release it. When you feel hurt, your instinct wants to hide behind coldness or silence. When you feel threatened, your instinct wants to attack or defend. But intention asks a different question. It asks what outcome you want to create through your words. Do you want clarity or escalation? Do you want connection or separation? Do you want healing or further distance? When you pause long enough to ask yourself these questions, your words begin to change. They become slower, calmer, and more connected to the deeper truth you want to express. Intentional speech also involves understanding the difference between expressing your truth and imposing your truth. Many conflicts become more intense because both individuals speak to persuade rather than to reveal. They speak to win rather than to connect. But when you speak with intention, you no longer enter the conversation with the goal of proving your perspective superior. Instead, you aim to communicate your experience with honesty and humility. You are not trying to change the other person. You are trying to share what is real for you in a way that can be received without resistance. When you speak with awareness, you choose words that reflect clarity rather than reactivity. Instead of saying what will hurt, you say what will illuminate. Instead of attacking the person, you describe your experience. Instead of making assumptions, you express curiosity. This approach softens both sides. It invites openness rather than defensiveness. Even if the other person does not immediately respond with the same level of awareness, your intention becomes the stabilizing force within the conversation. Another part of intentional speech is understanding that silence can be a form of communication. When you do not yet know what to say, choosing not to speak is more powerful than speaking without direction. Silence creates space for your thoughts to settle. It prevents you from saying words that you will later regret. It gives you time to return to your center before re-engaging. Most people fear silence because they associate it with weakness or uncertainty. But in truth, silence is often the birthplace of the most meaningful words. To speak with intention, you must also let go of the belief that every emotion needs immediate expression. Emotions are real, but they are not always reliable guides for communication. When you wait for your emotion to settle, the message you want to deliver becomes clearer and less tangled in the heat of the moment. The conversation becomes less about releasing tension and more about creating understanding. Over time, when you consistently practice intentional speech, you begin to see how powerful your words truly are. They can either create harmony or deepen division. They can either build bridges or destroy them. Speaking with intention means recognizing this power and using it with responsibility. It is the choice to transform communication from a reaction into a conscious act, one that invites clarity, strengthens connection, and reveals a more grounded version of yourself in every interaction. Building connection through shared responsibility means recognizing that every interaction is shaped by two inner worlds meeting each other. Conflict does not arise from one person alone, nor is its resolution the duty of only one side. When both individuals accept that their thoughts, emotions, assumptions, and reactions contribute to the dynamic, the entire atmosphere of the relationship begins to transform. This understanding removes the need for blame. Blame divides. Responsibility unites. It brings both people into the same space, working together, rather than standing against each other. Shared responsibility begins with the willingness to examine your own contribution to the tension. It is easy to focus on what the other person said or did, but connection deepens when you ask yourself what energy you brought into the moment. Did you listen fully? Did you speak with intention? Did you assume before asking? Did you allow your past experiences to shape your interpretation of the present? These questions are not meant to create guilt. They are meant to create awareness. When you understand your part in the conflict, you naturally soften. This softening makes it easier for the other person to meet you with openness. For connection to grow, both individuals must take ownership of their emotions instead of expecting the other to manage them. If you feel hurt, you express it honestly rather than hiding behind anger or silence. If you feel confused, you ask for clarity rather than creating assumptions. If you feel overwhelmed, you communicate your limit instead of pushing yourself until frustration takes over. When both sides speak from this place of ownership, the conversation becomes more human. There is less accusation and more understanding, less defensiveness and more vulnerability. Shared responsibility also means recognizing that connection is not sustained by grand gestures, but by small, consistent acts. It is maintained through patience when the other person is struggling. It is strengthened by curiosity when you do not understand their perspective. It grows through the willingness to repair after a difficult moment rather than ignoring it. Every time you choose understanding over ego, you contribute to building a foundation that can withstand future challenges. In many conflicts, people wait for the other person to take the first step. They wait for the apology, the explanation, or the softening. But connection deepens when you stop waiting. When you decide to be the one who brings awareness, stability, and sincerity into the conversation, you create a space where the other person feels safe enough to do the same. One person's responsibility invites the other person's responsibility. It becomes a cycle of healing rather than a cycle of tension. Building connection through shared responsibility also involves accepting that misunderstanding is natural. No matter how much two people care for each other, their perspectives will never align perfectly. Instead of resisting this truth, you learn to work with it. You begin to see differences not as threats, but as opportunities to understand aspects of life you may have overlooked. This mindset creates resilience. When both individuals see themselves as partners in the process of communication, conflict no longer becomes a battle between two sides. It becomes a joint exploration guided by honesty and awareness. Through shared responsibility, connection becomes deeper because both individuals are actively contributing to its strength. There is no expectation that one person must carry all the weight. Instead, each person brings their presence, their awareness, and their willingness to grow. In this balanced space, the bond becomes sturdier, more genuine, and more capable of transforming conflict into clarity and a deeper sense of understanding. In the end, the journey from conflict to clarity and connection is not shaped by extraordinary techniques or complex strategies. It is shaped by the simple, consistent choices you make in the quiet moments within yourself. When you understand the origins of your reactions, when you pause before responding, when you listen without defending, when you transform tension into stillness, when you speak with intention, and when you take shared responsibility for the space you create with others, conflict becomes something entirely different. It becomes a mirror that reveals your inner landscape and a path that leads you toward deeper awareness. Through these choices, you discover that clarity is not given by the situation. It is created by your state of mind. Connection is not demanded from another person. It is built through the presence you bring into each interaction. When you cultivate this way of living, conflict no longer pulls you apart. It guides you closer to your center and closer to those around you. It becomes a teacher reminding you that the quality of any relationship is rooted in the quality of your inner world. And when your inner world becomes grounded, patient, and aware, the relationships in your life naturally begin to reflect that same harmony.